Summer 1953 sits over the Korean peninsula like a held breath. Trenches cut along ridgelines, earth packed hard by boots and rain, show the outline of a front that barely moves. Watch posts peer across narrow valleys where smoke once hung every afternoon. Supply mules clatter along broken paths, their handlers speaking in low voices to avoid carrying sound. Near Panmunjom, tents rise on leveled dirt, cords staked to keep the canvas steady against humid wind. Men arrive in careful convoys, uniforms brushed clean, faces fixed, documents sealed in folders that seem heavier than paper. It looks like a pause shaped by exhaustion, not triumph. The routine of war persists in quieter form. Patrol schedules checked, field kitchens warmed, radios tuned to scratch and static. What may follow, by many accounts, is a truce that stops the shells, yet leaves the quarrel intact. This program presents a narrative reconstruction that may use composite details, based on public archives, wartime dispatches, and contemporary press statements, with measured inference where the record is thin. It remains a work of interpretation, not a final verdict. Names of specific individuals are set aside to focus on patterns of behavior, places, and procedures known to the period. The purpose is clarity rather than certainty. The mood is restrained because men in villages have already paid. We proceed carefully through a landscape of barbed wire and brief nods, telling the story of an armistice that appears to cool the battlefield while preserving the line that divides it. And we do so in the tempo of that year when the hills listened for an order that might never come. The standoff along the Korean front in early 1953 unfolds as a pattern of repetition shaped by terrain and weather. And that pattern feels decisive even when maps barely change. Men settle into dugouts cut into shale, timbers wedged across trench ceilings, and a floor layered with spent earth that turns to paste in rain, then bricks in sun. And the routine of each day depends on whether the valley fog lifts by mid-morning or holds until noon. Since clear air invites observation while haze grants relative safety, and this simple rhythm guides the placement of rations, the timing of patrols, and the quiet repairs to wire and parapet that fill the hours between alarms. Batteries sit back along gullies where tree cover survived earlier barrages, and crews maintain their pieces with care that looks almost ceremonial because sound carries in these hills. Commands are clipped, gestures matter, and the work proceeds as though any misstep could draw attention across the ravines where the other side peers through glass at every movement. Field reports in this season suggest contact remains intermittent but vivid, flares rising at night to measure distance, probes testing dead ground near streambeds, and the occasional burst that sends men to earth and then to the task of counting. An act performed with a steadiness that reads like discipline, but might be habit-learned under constant strain. Letters home, where permitted, choose plain words and avoid speculation. The war may be at a pause in spirit, if not in deed, yet no one in the trenches speaks of pauses, only of tasks scheduled by the hour, and of boots that must be dried near stoves that burn low to keep smoke thin. The food is basic and arrives late when rains cut paths into stair steps of mud, and the men eat quickly, spoon scraping tin quietly because quiet seems like a policy, even in safe corners, as if sound alone could invite risk. They clean mess kits with cloth that already smells of oil and earth, and they return to positions with the small comforts carried in pockets. A note, a button, a coin, items that feel like anchors in a routine that does not promise relief. In the forward trenches, officers check watches against an agreed schedule that has governed the sector for months. Patrol out at dusk along a track that hugs a fold in the ground. Halt at the notch where the ridge splits, lie to listen, and then crawl to the broken stone that marks the limit of safety, an inch at a time, because an inch can decide if a man returns before dawn. And this caution creates a kind of stillness that resembles peace to distant observers, but feels nothing like it to the men who taste soil each time they level their bodies against the slope. The enemy is rarely seen in full figure. Instead, observers mark hats, shoulders, a hand, a glint, a shovel lifting earth on the reverse side of a crest, and drawings in notebooks capture angles and shadows rather than faces, because angles and shadows predict where wire might be cut and where trip flares might stand. And these notations gain weight as the stalemate stretches long enough for memory to be unreliable. In such conditions, a clean sketch can matter more than a hasty recollection. Routine breeds its own kind of danger, since it tempts men to assume that tomorrow will mirror yesterday. Yet storms shift, creeks rise, and mines creep with the movement of wet soil. So maps are updated by pencil each week to show a tree now down or a path lost under a slide. And these marginal changes define whether a ration party can reach a forward bay before light. Even small errors accumulate into risk when time stretches. The men learn to rest in fragments and to trust the sound of a familiar cough or laugh within the platoon. And field chaplains, if present, keep their voices low for those who ask, offering sentences stripped of decoration because men do not want ornament here. They want brevity and facts about the next relief, which still might shift if a report arrives by radio from the company on the right saying that a search party did not return on time, and so the roster adjusts and fatigue lengthens by an hour that no one planned to give. This landscape of repetition holds the front steady, and the steadiness itself becomes evidence in meeting rooms far behind these lines where staff argue that positions can be held through the season, that the other side will also hold, and that neither hill nor valley offers a promise of swift success at acceptable cost. And this belief ripens into the understanding that the fight has turned into the work of waiting, which is why the men in trenches watch the sky and check their watches and keep their weapons clean. Not because they expect a sudden advance, but because readiness is the last honest duty they can perform while papers pass elsewhere. Two indicators appear in this period for those seeking firm ground beneath the general impression: routine battalion situation reports that note contact limited to patrol skirmishes and counter-mortar, and scheduled staff agenda notes that assign no major offensive tasks beyond local improvement of positions, and together they suggest a posture set to endure rather than to seize. As spring leans into summer, grass returns to slopes that were shaved by winter wind, and with the coarse green comes a concealment that pleases men who must cross open patches. Yet concealment cuts both ways, which is why patrol leaders argue for patience and for pauses at points that feel exposed. And this method spreads through the companies until it feels like doctrine earned on the ground, nowhere written, everywhere observed. In this climate, the rumor of talks gains a certain weight, though no one in the trench can measure it. They can only observe that shells fall less often some mornings and that announcements from higher command sound practiced, as if written with care to prevent expectation from running ahead of fact. And so the front watches and the hills hold, and the standoff remains a fact carved into the daily ledger. When orders finally direct units to maintain readiness for possible cessation of open fire pending formal notice, men nod without comment and check straps and water as they have each day, because habit is stronger than prediction here, and they wait for word that may arrive between one patrol and the next. The line stays still just long enough for the next development to feel possible, and in that narrow space the narrative moves forward toward the tents at Panmunjom, where words might begin to carry the work that shells can no longer justify. The settlement at Panmunjom comes into focus along a straight road where trucks arrive in measured order and men step down with folders pressed under elbows. And the setting looks provisional yet deliberate. A small grid of tents and low buildings aligned near open ground large enough for a motor pool and a signal mast. And inside the main tent, the air holds the damp heat of midsummer that softens paper and tests patience. And the furniture is functional because no one wants the scene to suggest comfort. The effect signals business first and last, and each session begins with formal greetings that sound like well-worn lines from a play produced again for a wary audience. Negotiators take their places by national parties, translators settle with notebooks open, clerks prepare to record, and across the table lies a map whose edges curl away from thumbtacks. Pencils trace possible boundaries, and those lines mirror the front with adjustments here and there, a bend around a hill, a straightening across a valley floor that once carried rice water, and while the line on paper seems simple, every shift implies ownership of ground where men have fallen, and that implication hangs over the room like a presence no one names aloud. The language of these sessions aims for precision on items that feel massive, even when reduced to clauses: cessation of hostilities, demarcation of forces, supervision of the truce, and the exchange of prisoners. And the debate turns on phrasing that admits little error, since a single word can compel a behavior at the line that might otherwise be optional, and both delegations know the value of an article, the timing of a verb, and the weight of a comma placed after a date. Statements proceed in measured cadence. Translators repeat each sentence in the formal voice of the era, and questions come with lists attached because no one here wants ambiguity to return to the hills as confusion. The rule is clarity that binds, and the tactic is delay that might secure a better position by sunset. Two artifacts define the day for those who prefer paper to rumor: a draft schedule for future sessions pinned to a board that names start times and agenda items, and a set of memorandum notes that summarize positions taken, concessions proposed, and objections entered. And these materials, while not dramatic, yield the shape of movement across weeks that feels slow to the men in line, but swift to the men at tables. The subject of supervision proves thorny, because supervision implies the presence of observers at points along a border that has not yet been built, and observers imply authority to report events that commanders might prefer to interpret. And so the talk circles around mechanisms and boards and neutral parties, and each party tests clauses that could limit embarrassment if a patrol misfires or if fog blurs a boundary marker. The tone remains formal, yet the stakes are personal for officers whose reputations sit near the edge of each sentence. The matter of maps returns often. Each new draft adds small figures to mark checkpoints, huts, and spans of road that will carry supply carts to positions that should now feed men rather than fire. And while the hope of rest sits on the table in that sense, no one lifts it openly because the practice here is to let hope hide behind the next clause, where it can remain unspoiled by the pressure of eyes. Outside the tent, the scene holds its own order. Guards rotate in pairs, lists are verified at entrances, and couriers move with envelopes whose seals are checked at origin and destination. And all of it gives the proceedings a ritual shape that feels sturdy, a shape intended to resist both anger and haste. And perhaps that shape is what sustains progress when tempers rise as they sometimes do over a disputed hill crest that appears tiny on paper, but commands fields of fire the men in trenches know by heart. In private, some delegates may admit that the line, now drawn in pencil, already exists in practice along the front, an irregular trace of bunkers and posts that neither side can dislodge without large cost, and that this reality should govern the treaty. In public, the same delegates describe principal positions and speak of fairness that must be seen to be legitimate. And within that gap between private admission and public framing, the work moves forward inch by inch, because inches are what the front taught everyone to respect. Student clerks later will remember the sound of chairs scraping as men stand at adjournment, and the fatigue in shoulders after hours of controlled speech. They will note that cigarettes burned to filters by mid-afternoon, and that water jugs emptied despite the attempt to ration breaks. And such details mark time as surely as clocks, because time here is both resource and weapon, with each side managing it to push the other toward a sentence that yields a measure of advantage. The question of prisoners, always waiting at the edge of the agenda, enters formally as a matter of process. Yet the room tightens as the topic begins, and even the clerks feel it. Because prisoners are not terrain or numbers, but people who may refuse to return. And refusal produces a category poorly served by simple exchange rules. This tension cannot be solved by cartography, and so the language must account for choice. And choice proves hard to certify in a camp where influence operates in ways that papers register only dimly. In these sessions, precision attempts to replace passion without denying its force, and that attempt demands an exactness that tires the hand and the ear, yet grants a framework to hand to units at the line. And the men at the line will need such a framework if the pause is to hold. They require instructions that can be read without interpretation at 2 a.m. under a shielded lamp, when a sound near the wire brings men to readiness. The final pages of the day are gathered and initialed, and adjournment sends men out into humid air, where engines start with a cough and settle to idle, while orders ride back to the next echelon. And on those rides the talk falls away, because speech has been spent, and because the hills that frame the road remind everyone that arguments outside this valley have long been settled by fire. The hope, guarded but present, is that words now hold long enough for silence to feel less like a tactic and more like a habit. The convoy taillights shrink along the dirt, and the next morning brings the same routine with a new clause at stake. And from this slow build of agreement, the Armistice text begins to take its final shape. Even as the most delicate portion waits in camps surrounded by fences and watchtowers a short drive away. The prisoner question enters the narrative with a weight that cannot be dispersed by tidy language, because the human core resists equal exchange, and camps across the rear areas become the focus of policy and rumor, with fences trimmed, gates checked thrice each shift, and administrative tents stocked with forms that attempt to capture a decision that will shape lives already cut by years of upheaval. Men and women in custody consider a return that might invite sanction, or a decision to refuse repatriation that might invite isolation. And both paths look uncertain to those who must sign their names under watch that remains steady but not unkind. Because guards here follow instructions to keep order, not to inflame. The system designed to process choice relies on interviews recorded in spare language by clerks trained to avoid pressure, and observers from neutral parties are scheduled to appear to provide a second set of eyes whose presence may reduce suspicion of coercion. These elements are noted in meeting minutes that summarize the day's activity, and in a formal statement issued to the press that outlines procedures without detail. And for those building a record, these two indicators help anchor perception in a period flooded by claim and counterclaim. As the process proceeds, tensions flare in places where groups inside differ over the decision to return or to stay, and the camps respond by adjusting schedules, separating factions at mealtimes, and moving interviews to locations where acoustics prevent one choice from being heard by those waiting, all to preserve the quiet needed for people to speak without immediate consequence from peers. None of this guarantees purity of decision, which the policy architects acknowledge with hedging language that admits influence may persist in any collective setting. Yet the effort suggests an intent to approach fairness under conditions that are not ideal. Stories circulate of individuals who ask for assurances, not in grand terms, but in modest ones: a place to live, a chance to find work, a way to send a message home if the choice is to remain. Such requests travel up channels and rarely receive firm answers. Since an armistice text cannot promise a full life, it can only open a door, and so the uncertainty remains, contained but active, like a current under slow water that moves a boat even when the oars rest. The guards drawn from units rotated off the line maintain a routine that keeps tempers at manageable levels. Inspections occur at regular hours, recreation space is regulated yet real, and medical tents treat common ailments with competence that calms rather than excites. And the tone of these places, while constrained, aims to prevent the shock that sometimes accompanies large group decisions, especially when rumors bloom in heat and boredom. It is a kind of social engineering executed with the blunt tools available in that year and place. When disturbances erupt, as they inevitably do on days when lists are posted or when an event outside the wire triggers fear inside, the response is measured and immediate, with officers reading orders aloud and negotiators at Panmunjom notified within hours. Because no one wants a camp incident to unravel the thin thread that connects tents to trenches. Hence, reports flow both directions, and adjustments to protocol can occur within a day. Another sign that the system, while creaky, retains some agility under pressure. Outside the fences, families wait along routes that lead nowhere near these camps, and couriers carry parcels allowed by rule, small bundles of clothing or food that give the process a human scale without altering the broader calculus. And this detail matters because policy can flatten individuals into cases and numbers. And the parcels remind those in charge that the decision at hand touches kitchens and courtyards far from the administrative tents. Interviews proceed in low rooms where a table separates the clerk from the subject. A translator may sit alongside if needed, and the questions follow a template meant to elicit a clear statement of preference. Then the paper is signed, and copies are made for files that will travel with convoys to exchange points when the broader agreement is enacted. There is a ritual feel to the steps, and that ritual grants a measure of predictability to participants who have lived under uncertain rules for too long. The public language surrounding the process remains careful. Official statements note progress and reiterate respect for choice, while the Panmunjom notes capture disagreements over specific cases where evidence suggests pressure may have been applied, and those cases are set aside for review rather than allowed to stall the entire system, which signals a preference for momentum with safeguards over a purity that might never be reachable in this context. By mid-season, lists take final form, though they remain subject to revision until the moment of exchange, and buses are prepared with routes to neutral points established in the text still being polished. Drivers receive briefings that read like checklists for steady driving rather than heroics, and the emphasis throughout is to reduce the unpredictable by saturating the process with small controls that accumulate into stability, a practical method learned by commands that have lived with volatility for 3 years. The men in the hills hear about these steps in fragments and tend to react with restrained curiosity. Some see the process as a measure of how serious the other side is about the truce. Others file it under matters decided by people with pens, not rifles, and the majority continue to clean weapons, adjust wire, and memorize signals because their duty remains intact until a direct order says otherwise. And no one wants to be the reason the last hour before quiet fails. When the exchange logistics are finally briefed, they come tied to the broader Armistice structure, then near completion, and the camp routines merge with that larger machine. Dates appear in margin notes, and times are tentatively assigned to convoys that will move with flags displayed to minimize mistake. And even this level of detail does not ease the sense that any event can still disrupt plans, a realism earned through long months where the unexpected often made itself at home. The day before implementation brings a hush to the camps that differs from ordinary quiet. Men gather in small groups, speak in low tones about simple things, and sleep comes early if it comes at all. And in that hush, the process of choice comes to rest, prepared to tip into action if the paperwork holds and if the discipline at the line remains firm as hands reach for cables that will unroll and for posts that will mark a boundary about to harden. Implementation begins at dawn with work that feels humble yet profound, and the first visible change is the appearance of posts set at regular intervals along a trace that survey teams have walked for days. a trace that mirrors the fighting line with practical corrections for ground that will not hold a straight run. And into this oil crew's drive stakes unroll wire and hang signs that use plain language to declare a boundary that did not exist yesterday in such sharp form. The men assigned to this duty move with care born of long practice in risk management, not because this is combat, but because ground here holds memories of shells and traps. And no one wants the opening gesture of quiet to be marked by an avoidable injury. They speak in short phrases carried hand to hand. They set distances by pace and eye, and they check each section twice before moving forward. Where a road crosses the new line, engineers prepare gates that can open on agreement and close in a heartbeat. And guards learn routines that specify how a visitor will be received, how papers will be checked, and how a return will be recorded. And these routines answer questions in advance, so the temper does not choose an answer in a crowded moment. Supervisors keep a ledger of completed segments and of materials used, an administrative habit that now feels like a stabilizing force because it tracks progress in units that can be counted, and counting has been rare in a war defined by uncertainty. Two indicators help anchor this phase for those away from the line: a supervised inspection log that notes the placement of markers and the condition of access points, and a formal communique that lists the locations scheduled for joint observation on specific days. And together, they suggest that oversight, while limited, exists in a form sturdy enough to notice small problems before they expand. In the center of the arrangement sits a compound designated for direct contact between sides when needed, a set of rooms built with an eye toward symmetry and visibility. And its function is to turn episodes into discussions rather than into incidents. And that purpose shapes small details like table length and seating order, details that might feel ceremonial, but in this setting, keep new friction from finding purchase. On nearby ridges, watch positions remain manned as before, yet the posture shifts. Weapons are not at the shoulder, but at rest within reach. And binoculars scan for movement that looks like error rather than attack. And this recalibration of intent shows in the manner of speech along the line, which leans toward formal politeness, backed by caution. Commanders issue field bulletins that repeat the terms of the new arrangement in language that a tired corporal can read at 3 a.m. without confusion. And these bulletins include examples of allowed and forbidden conduct drawn from likely cases, like a stray animal crossing the wire or a civilian wagon approaching at dusk, because this is how misunderstanding is reduced in practice. Along low ground where streams cut the boundary, crews sink posts into gravel beds and suspend markers from cables stretched between banks, since water levels will rise in storms and carry signs away, if not secured. This attention to the small engineering of peace seems prosaic, and yet it holds great value because the first weeks decide whether the arrangement feels real to those who live near it. As the line hardens, roads that once ran uninterrupted now terminate at points with sentries and shelters, and maps used by local administrators are amended with neat strokes that turn through routes into stubs, and the language of travel shifts to include new phrases that convey permission, detour, and checkpoint. And this vocabulary spreads through markets and schools as quickly as it spreads through barracks. The psychological effect of a visible boundary is immediate. Men on each side can fix distance with certainty now, and that certainty reduces some anxieties while creating others, because distance that can be measured also invites measurement of duty and challenge. And commanders know they must teach that the challenge lies in restraint rather than in probing the new line. A schedule for joint verification begins within days, and small teams meet at predetermined markers to compare notes on the status of signs and fences. And the tone at these meetings strives for courteous accuracy without warmth or accusation, since the early goal is to establish that structure can function even when trust is thin. The teams speak through agreed interpreters, the notes are exchanged, and each side returns to its lanes with the knowledge that the other has heard the same list of defects and repairs. A modest but real step toward a shared frame of reference. In villages cut by the boundary, elders gather to trace old paths on the ground with sticks, marking where footbridges once stood and where fields now extend into zones that no one may enter. And these gatherings produce requests for controlled crossings that officials receive, file and schedule for review under new procedures still being taught to clerks. Order will come, the papers say, but not quickly. Meanwhile, the hills remember, and men on outposts still wake at midnight to sounds that raise the pulse. An animal in brush, a tree branch falling after wind, and the training of years sends them to position. Yet the new routine adds a layer of thought before action, a mental check that asks whether the sound fits a pattern of error rather than intent. And in that narrow pause, the Armistice finds another foothold. Supply units learn updated routes that swing wide to avoid the boundary and that deliver rations in sequences designed to prevent suggestive movement near observation points. Even the timing of rest breaks changes to avoid bunching trucks at turns that sit within sight of the other side. The cumulative effect of these small adaptations is a daily rhythm with fewer sharp edges. But the rhythm remains tight because no one believes the danger is gone, only pared back to a form that men can manage without breaking. Where minds are known to rest, signs worn in terse words and in symbols plain enough for a child to read, and teams sweep lanes that will become permanent service routes under the gaze of both sides. And as each lane opens, a little more of the boundary becomes navigable in the controlled sense that the arrangement demands. The first week ends with a summary report that lists the total markers planted, the number of verified segments, and the incidents recorded, which are few and minor, and that report becomes a paper proof that careful preparation and patient labor can hold a line quiet for more than a day. Night falls on wire that glints under starlight, on posts that cast short shadows in the moon, and on sentries who count time by the passing of relief and by the taste of tea cooling in tin cups. And their calm, while conditional, is real enough to make the next phase possible, which will move from hardware and signs to behavior along a frontier now formalized. The second phase lives in conduct, not construction, and it begins with instructions read aloud to platoons that define what a patrol is now allowed to do and what it must avoid. And those instructions emphasize distance from the boundary, clarity in signaling, and restraint in response. And the aim is to prevent a single misread gesture from unraveling the new quiet. Patrols continue because ground must be known even in peace that is not yet peace, and the patrols walk along interior routes that shadow the line without touching it, eyes scanning for changes in terrain, for fresh footprints, for signs that a marker has shifted, and they record their observations in notebooks with headings that make later comparisons straightforward. So trends can be detected before alarms are needed. The appearance of broadcasts across the boundary becomes a feature of the soundscape, scheduled at hours when men are likely to be alert, and the messages carry claims and predictions designed to influence rather than to inform. And commands instruct units to note content but not respond, because reply would create a dialogue that could swallow the day. This one-way pressure is treated as weather, unpleasant but ordinary. The first minor violations occur within a week, and they look like this. A small party steps too close to a marker during a routine check and is challenged with a voice command rather than a shot, then guided back along a visible path, and the event is recorded by both sides in matching forms, which show that procedure has begun to replace temper. Later, a farmer leads livestock near a flagged stake, and a sentry signals with a raised hand and a whistle to warn of danger, and a guard detail escorts the men and animals to a safer lane, then notes the point on a map so that a barrier can be extended around a curve. Such events do not test the agreement so much as train it. Two indicators lend weight to the picture from this period. A daily incident sheet compiled by liaison officers that lists time, location, and action, taken for each boundary event, and a set of joint meeting notes that confirm both parties recorded the same facts. And these pairings of documents suggest that the system works when the stakes are low, which is how stability is built. Weather throws its own challenges into the mix. Summer storms swell streams and wash out small footings. Fog falls into valleys until late morning, and the reduced visibility alters judgment, which is why the rules include a clause that tightens movement during low sight. And commanders reinforce this clause in morning briefings whenever the forecast threatens to limit view. The men adapt, as they always do, by adding time to their movements and by carrying a mental checklist that slows action without freezing it. And at day's end, this extra caution tastes like fatigue, but it also tastes like safety. The practice of reporting grows almost comfortable. Sentries call in updates on fence condition and on the state of warning signs. Patrol leaders hand over notes that describe minor encounters with accuracy but little drama. And staff build a file that answers predictable queries from oversight teams with copies rather than with argument. In this way, administration becomes a shield against escalation because a documented fact leaves less room for suspicion to expand. A handful of nights bring tension when flares appear over a distant sector and men brace for follow-on events. But the flares fade without incident, and the next day's meeting records a training exercise conducted within agreed limits. An explanation that calms but also teaches that surprises will occur even under rules. Civilians continue to approach the boundary at awkward points, and units form small outreach parties that walk nearby villages to explain the safest lanes, using simple maps and plain words, a practice that does more for stability than a company of guards, because understanding flows into habit when spoken by someone who can point at a hill and name it. The psychological load on men at the line remains high, despite fewer shocks. They know that quiet can end with a snap, and they manage this load with routines that break the day into tasks. Weapon checks at fixed hours, short drills that reinforce signals, cleaning gear in the late afternoon when light is good but heat has begun to fall. And in the night, watches they rely on the small fellowship of a shared post, where two can listen better than one. The chain of command conducts unannounced inspections that read as care rather than suspicion, since the purpose is to ensure that instructions make sense on the ground. And when a clause proves awkward in practice, a revision is drafted and carried to the next liaison session, where language is adjusted slightly to match reality as observed by the men who must live with it. In this period, a culture of correction grows, quiet and pragmatic, that replaces the culture of contest that dominated earlier years. And this shift does not erase hostility, but it frames it with rules that match the new season. There are still moments when voices rise across the line, when a gesture is misread and men posture at posts, but the rules say that a posture must relax on the next order, and the orders do come, often within a minute, a sign that everyone understands how thin the margin remains and how valuable a minute can be. By month's end, the incident sheets show a pattern of minor issues resolved by talk or by small adjustments to fencing and signs, and the count of serious events remains low, and this record is shared in summaries that go up the chain and out to the parties who watch from a distance and judge whether the armistice deserves continued labor. On a quiet evening, a patrol returning along a ridge pauses to look at valleys where fields reflect late light, and the men say little because there is little to add. They feel the weight of gear, the itch of sweat, the relief of routine, and they walk on because routine is what stands between this quiet and the memory of chaos. And tomorrow will bring the same route and the same checks if the weather holds. Beyond the wire, villages that line the new boundary settle into a rhythm that looks stable from a distance and uneven up close, and this rhythm is defined by markets that reopen on days agreed with local posts, by schools that mark attendance with fewer gaps than last year, and by fields that draw workers at first light when the air is cool and the risk of wandering too near a marker stays low because work rows start far from the line. Roofs are repaired with tiles that do not match. Courtyards are swept clean with brooms bound from reeds, and water carriers bend to their tasks along paths that arc away from signs that warn of danger. And these small acts of normal life carry a dignity that the villagers do not discuss yet guard with care. Travel permits become part of the household kit, folded into cloth bundles alongside tools and grain measures, and the process to secure a permit remains formal enough to remind everyone that the boundary is not a rumor but a structure. And in the chime of stamps on paper, people hear the shape of the new world. Traders learn to time their carts to avoid stacking at checkpoints, and they sort goods into packages easy to inspect so delays remain brief. And guards, recognizing familiar faces over weeks, speed the process with a nod, an efficiency that lives within the rules rather than pushing against them. Two indicators from this period help connect civilian life to the broader arrangement. A set of local administration schedules that announce market days, crossing hours, and school openings under the Armistice framework, and brief field notes from liaison visits that record the condition of access lanes and the state of warning signs near settlements. And these documents, sparse but steady, show a system trying to support daily life without erasing the boundary that defines it. Some families find themselves split by the line with relatives visible at a distance they cannot bridge, and communication becomes a matter of letters carried through approved channels or of messages passed in formal settings when delegations meet. And while these messages move slower than a shout across a field, they move, which is more than could be said months earlier. The presence of the boundary reshapes social time. Festivals shrink to courtyards. Weddings happen, with guests counted carefully. And funerals follow routes that respect posted warnings, and in each case, the ritual adapts, losing some breadth but keeping its core signals intact so that memory can anchor in altered soil. Work resettles alongside fear that has lost its edge, but not its place. Farmers walk known rows and avoid the edges that meet new lanes. Children are told which stones they may not climb. And elders sit on shaded benches and advise patience, because patience has delivered the first full harvest in years, even if yields trail the hopes whispered in kitchens. The tone of official speech in these villages echoes the posture at the line. It is courteous, procedural, and cautious, and this tone seeps into conversation between neighbors who discuss news in plain sentences that test facts rather than indulge rumor, because rumor once carried pain, and the memory of that pain remains close enough to touch. A small clinic opens in one settlement with a midwife and a handful of remedies, and its ledger records visits by season rather than diagnosis, and the midwife, practical and calm, keeps to a routine that aligns to the new travel schedule so that people can reach her without crossing into risk. And her presence becomes one of the subtle proofs that daily life can grow around the fence like grass around a stone. Still, the boundary asserts itself in ways that cannot be softened. Fields that once joined across a stream now end at a warning rope. A mill wheel stands still because the channel that fed it runs through a zone no one may enter. And a boy who strays too near a marker is called back by three voices at once: his parent, a neighbor, and a guard who understands that kindness enforces the rule better than a shout on a quiet day. Merchants find new routes that skirt the boundary and link villages on the same side. And these routes create fresh ties that alter the flow of goods and news. And over time, these ties may matter more than the old connections cut by the line. Though no one says so aloud, because loyalty to the past remains strong, even as the present writes new habits into the land. When the harvest comes, wagons gather in squares with measured pride, and the grain is weighed with scales that never quite balance perfectly. And laughter returns in brief bursts that feel real and not performed. And for an hour, the boundary seems to fade into the background of mountains and sky. Yet at dusk, the signs and fences reappear in the mind, and the wagons turn home along safe lanes. Lights shielded, voices low near the posts. The presence of oversight parties in nearby sectors becomes a mild spectacle for children who count vehicles and for elders who note the cut of uniforms, and the adults manage this attention with discretion, answering questions in a way that teaches interest without leaning into spectacle. Because drama has been costly here, and no one seeks its return. When winter's edge appears in early frost on ditch water, villages tighten routines once more, stacking wood, repairing doors, and marking footpaths with stones painted in light colors so that even in snow, a person can see where not to step, and guards adjust their watches to account for longer nights and the way cold sharpens sound. And in this season, the Armistice shows its second test. Quieter than summer, but more unforgiving if care falls short. The settlements hold to their schedules and to their manners, and the lines on both sides keep to their orders. And this mutual adherence builds a ledger of uneventful days that, while unremarkable, carry more hope than a dozen speeches. Because uneventful is the one quality that families near a frontier now prize. As the year turns within the same era, the villages live with the knowledge that the arrangement could tilt, and they respond with simple acts that make tilting less likely. A fence repaired quickly, a misunderstanding corrected in a meeting rather than in a field, a child taught to wave from a distance rather than to wander close. Night gathers early, lamps glow behind paper windows, and the border holds under the weight of ordinary life, which is the best weight it can bear for now. And in that steadiness, the narrative moves toward a closing that does not decide, but records how far careful routine can carry a place once the guns fall silent. The Armistice settles over the peninsula like a practiced routine. Posts stand at set distances. Signs speak in voices that do not change with mood. Ledgers fill with small notes that tell a story of caution and persistence. Each day closes with numbers checked and gates secured. Rumor still moves, but practice weighs more than whispers. This account remains a reconstruction drawn from public reports, inspection notes, and contemporary statements with cautious inference where the record thins. It favors patterns over personalities and procedures over passion, because those are the pieces that seem to hold when memory grows loud. What follows from this arrangement is not a victory parade, but a method for living beside a line. Men in outposts learn the texture of quiet as if it were another skill. Families pace fields set back from markers and find harvests that do not make headlines. Officials trade lists, not threats. Even so, the questions persist and may never leave the rooms where they were first spoken. How long can a boundary maintain order without granting closure? Which habits become culture and which remain only rules? Where do small violations end and new norms begin? The answers appear to rest in logbooks, in meeting agendas, and in the patience of those who repeat the same tasks tomorrow. The story chooses no ending and offers no verdict. It records a frontier that seems stable because many hands refuse to let it slip. We leave the year in place and the line intact, with a final look toward posts that catch first light and toward a table in Panmunjom where papers may again be open, and where the next clause, still unwritten, could change the distance between two markers by the width of a finger or by the length of a season.